There's a philosophical thought experiment where one imagines that China is engaged in all of these individual activities by all of the individual Chinese people, but it turns out, unbeknownst to any of them individually, that the totality of all of their actions are such that a brain emerges. So one particular individual, unbeknownst to him or her, turns out to be that what they're doing and who they're communicating with during the day ends up mimicking the actions of a neuron in a brain, right? So that particular person happens to be acting just like a neuron, let's say in V1, visual cortex, in a brain. And some other person on the other side turns out to be acting just like a motor neuron, a particular motor neuron. And the reason the Chinese makes a good example for this is just there's a lot of Chinese. There's enough that it starts to be enough, enough people to think about as enough neurons to have a brain emerge. And so the thought experiment is really asking, well, where is this sentient entity? Is there a sentient entity if they're all mimicking the actual dynamics and neural behavior of some particular brain, and they're just mimicking all of that? Then functionalism, which means that sort of computational functionalism, which means that if you're carrying all the right computations, then consciousness or, the thing should emerge in some sense just from that. It doesn't matter that it's built out of neural stuff, or biological stuff, or carbon stuff, as long as it is implementing the same kinds of computations. And it seems, of course, crazy on its face that there could be some entity, some brain that's emerged somewhere, sort of, amidst across the entire population of China that's thereby thinking and seeing and feeling what, and so it makes one start to think, what could that even mean, right? But what you may have noticed in terms of, if you've been following my series, the kinds of things that we talk about in collective hysteria and emergent phenomena, all of the stuff that goes on, if you want to understand socio-political phenomena, if you want to understand the everyday stuff of politics, almost all of the key explanations are not because Doug did that or Trump did that. Sometimes, of course, leaders have disproportionate effects. They do that. But if you really want to understand the large-scale movements of societies, it's done at the emergent level. It's because each of us individually is just one little neuron in a much larger thinking brain. Now, what ends up being selected for is often due to the entire network. It's not selected such that we're an entire brain that was designed through evolution, but still, when there's an entire group of millions or billions of people in some kind of socio-political movement, you end up with all of this concomitant structure. You end up with narratives that evolve over time. They justify the membership signals that they have. They imbue them with virtue and goodness. They tend to point and come up with justifications for why those in other groups are unclean outgroups that should be discriminated against. Many consequences happen that individually no one is responsible for. I mean, I'm not saying they're not responsible, but they're not purposely doing it. These are consequences only explainable by understanding the whole, right? So although that particular example of Chinese people in totality being a brain is a fantasy, every socio-political movement is in some sense a minor brain that are carrying out all of these complex actions for which you and me are unaware. Just like the individual Chinese person would be unaware that they're part of this emergent brain that comes to be thinking and being sentient by virtue of, needing each of their individual neural firings, such as it were. It's happening all the time, every day, every moment of your life. We're all involved in activities, in computation, so to speak, that lead to new structures at the large-scale level of your own socio-political community that you are not aware of. And only historians looking back can sometimes say, okay, we watched it transition over time in this way and that way. And it turns out the individuals were acting in such a way that it did that. Some, the individuals were reinforcing certain ideas and wanting to reinforce those ideas or push back. There was all of these kinds of dynamics that occurred, but the individuals weren't doing it because they saw the overall movements or the computations at the whole level of the socio-political community. So it's in this sense, we really are individually neurons in our own socio-political brains. And that should make you think differently about whether or not we really have great access to what is going on and the motivations and the reasons and the explanations underlying why sociopolitical movements are doing what they do. It's not simple. That was your science moment.